The bell above the lobby door made its usual sad little ding, but I don't remember seeing the door open. They were just there, standing on the rug with the faded welcome text. Two men, overdressed for the desert. One carried a briefcase, the other held his hands a little too still. I didn't see them blink. They asked, without names or pleasantries, if a certain guest was staying with us at the Dreamland Motel. Their voices were flat but polite, like someone had studied how to speak English from airport instructional videos. I told them we don't share information about our guests. They didn't argue. They just looked at me. Not threatening, just present in a way that made me want to take a long shower afterwards. There was something persuasive in the air, like a pressure behind my eyes, a suggestion without words. Still, I held the line. No names, no room numbers. They exchanged a glance that felt like static, and then asked for a room of their own. I handed them the key to room 504, top floor, end of the hall, away from the other guests. It's one of those rooms the housekeeping staff always avoid if they can help it. No one ever asks for 504. They didn't flinch, just nodded once in perfect unison. They didn't ask about the ice machine that always hums in a minor key outside the door. Didn't comment on the hall light that flickers Morse code nobody's been able to translate. They just took the key, an old brass one, real heavy, and vanished up the stairwell. No elevator ride, no footsteps. No phone call for towels, no midnight TV static, no checkout in the morning. Just the key, placed neatly on the counter, cold to the touch. The maid said the beds were still made, no drinks taken from the mini refrigerator. We don't talk about room 504 much, but every now and then, when the wind comes in from the canyon just right, you can hear them pacing in there. Welcome to the Dreamland Motel. If you're joining us for the first time, don't worry. Check-in's always open, and we've saved you a quiet room near the back, where the neon doesn't quite reach. Here, the stories are told softly, like confessions or dreams. Some are true, some are folklore. Some are the kind of stories you only hear once and never mention again. But all of them belong to the strange and shifting world of UFOs, unexplained phenomenon, and the thin veil that lies between this world and whatever's just behind it. Tonight, we're talking about the men in black, and not the ones with theme songs and sunglasses. These are the ones who show up when you see too much, the ones who don't quite move right, the ones who always seem to know your name, even if you've never said it out loud. If you like what you hear, consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a kind review. It helps keep the neon flashing and keeps the shadows where they belong. Now, let's begin. So, who are they, really? The men in black. You've heard the name before, maybe in a headline, likely in a movie. But the ones we're talking about tonight aren't cracking jokes or chasing CGI aliens. These men in black don't show up on cue. They appear when something slips through, when someone sees what they weren't meant to see. They ask questions that don't make sense, speak in voices that don't quite match their mouths. Sometimes they flash a badge, sometimes they don't need to. Some say they're government agents, sent to silence, distract, or discredit. Others say they're something else entirely. Not men at all, not really. Too tall, too pale, too quiet. They knock when no one should know where you live. They arrive before you've told anyone what you saw. Some come with credentials, others come with static in their wake. Call them what you like, but for now, we'll call them what they've always been called: the Men in Black. Guardians of the hidden. That's who we're dealing with tonight. But as you'll hear, that title can mean a lot of things. Some stories sound like spy thrillers, Cold War agents and intelligence officers using silence as a weapon. Others feel more like ghost stories, told in low voices at the edge of sleep, with visitors who don't quite breathe right, and cars that vanish the moment you blink. We'll begin with one of the earliest documented encounters with these strange men. And then we'll talk about Albert Bender, whose story gave birth to the entire Men in Black myth. We'll drift through strange encounters in Point Pleasant and beyond, where the visitors didn't seem human at all. We'll then meet Richard Doty, a real-life Air Force officer whose job was to confuse the truth, and who may have destroyed a man's life in the process. We'll explore the overlap between folklore and disinformation, between performance and reality, between protection and control. Because if the Men in Black are guardians, then the question becomes, what exactly are they protecting? And who gets to decide what stays hidden? To understand that, we need to go back to where all this started. Before Roswell, before the cameras turned skyward, before anyone had a name for the phenomenon, there was a man on a boat. The date was June 21st, 1947. Harold Dahl was patrolling the waters near Maury Island, just off the coast of Washington State. He wasn't alone. His teenage son was with him. So were two crewmen and a dog. They were checking the driftwood and dead logs that could damage larger ships. But that afternoon, the skies were clear and the water was calm. And then the sky cracked open. According to Dahl, they saw 6 metallic objects hovering overhead, round, silent, donut-shaped, each with a hole in the centre. 5 moved in formation. The 6th, however, seemed injured, spiralling awkwardly, dipping lower. Then it began to leak. Slag, dark molten material, rained down over the bay. It shattered the boat's windscreen. It burned Dahl's son. And tragically, it killed their dog. The men scrambled for cover, shielding themselves from the falling debris. Eventually, the wobbling craft recovered and rejoined the others. Then, the 6 craft flew off together, leaving nothing but silence, terror, and scorched metal behind. Dahl collected fragments of the debris. He claimed to have taken photographs, and when he got back to shore, he told his supervisor, a man named Fred Chrisman. The next morning, Harold received a visit. A man in a dark suit with a dark hat, driving a black 1947 Buick, polished like a showroom floor. He didn't force his way in. On the contrary, He invited Dahl to breakfast. At a local diner, they sat in a booth. The man ordered for both of them without asking. And then he spoke, calmly and clearly. He told Dahl exactly what had happened the day before. The 6 objects, the hot debris, the injuries, the dog. Dahl hadn't gone public. He hadn't told the press. Only Chrisman knew. And yet, here this man was, reciting it all, word for word. Then came the warning. What I have said is proof to you that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe. You had better forget what you have seen and keep quiet. The man never said who he worked for. He didn't show a badge. He didn't threaten violence. But it was clear enough that he didn't need to. Fred Chrisman, curious and bold, collected more of the debris. He reached out to a pulp publisher named Ray Palmer, who in turn contacted Kenneth Arnold, the pilot who'd seen the 9 flying saucers just days later near Mount Rainier. The military took an interest. On July 31st, 2 Army Air Force intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, flew from California to investigate. They interviewed Dahl and Chrisman, collected debris, and boarded a B-25 bomber to fly home. The next morning, the plane crashed. It burst into flames over Kelso, Washington. Both men lost their lives. After the crash, the FBI stepped in. Agent Jack Wilcox investigated on orders from J. Edgar Hoover himself. Wilcox's notes, now declassified, are cold and methodical. He recorded that Dahl and Chrisman had confessed to staging a hoax. But when asked directly, Dahl said something else. He told Wilcox he was afraid, that he didn't want any more trouble, that he would say it was a hoax if it would make the problem go away. But he never stopped believing in what he saw, not in private, not to his family. The FBI closed the case. The Army labelled it the dirtiest hoax in UFO history. Of course, there was a full investigation into why the B-25 exploded in mid-air over Kelso. Rumours spiralled. Sabotage. A cover-up. Some said the debris had been more than just slag. Something unearthly. Something someone didn't want reaching Wright-Patterson. But the official story was simpler. A mechanical failure, an engine fire, a tragic accident. No conspiracy. Just bad luck mixed with coincidence. And yet, in the law that followed, the fire became something else. A signal that the men in black weren't just watching. They were cleaning up. And as a result, the name Maury Island slipped into obscurity. But for those who look closely, this is where it began. The very first visit from a man in black. Not flashing a badge, not brandishing a weapon, just knowing things he shouldn't, and asking very politely that you forget. Maybe it was all a hoax, maybe it wasn't. The slag was real, the crash was real. 2 men died. And Harold Dahl, whatever he saw, whatever he feared, he never spoke of it again, not in public. A sighting, a warning, a retreat. It's the same pattern we'll see again and again, like the rhythm of a ghost story. And that man in the black suit, the one who knew too much and smiled too little, he wasn't the last. In fact, for one man, the visitors came back. Not on the water, but in a quiet attic room in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And they didn't just bring a warning. They brought silence and the beginning of a legend. It didn't happen in the desert. It didn't happen under a craft in the sky. It happened in Albert Bender's attic. A room filled with ticking clocks, skulls, horror memorabilia, and one man, alone, trying to understand what was visiting our skies. Albert Bender was no ordinary UFO researcher. He didn't have clearance. He didn't claim military ties. He worked a day job as a timekeeper and spent his nights surrounded by glowing skulls and ritual symbols in what he called his chamber of horrors. A lifelong lover of the strange. He wasn't trying to expose the government. He just wanted to know what was out there. In 1952, Albert formed the International Flying Saucer Bureau, the first civilian UFO group of its kind. Think MUFON before MUFON. Its newsletter, Space Review, was small but spirited. Enthusiasts from around the world wrote in. Some sent drawings, others shared sightings, and Albert quietly tried to make sense of the growing storm. He even invited Albert Einstein to join the group. A handwritten letter sent with hope and curiosity. Einstein declined. And yet, something else accepted. Something that started watching him back. First, it was the phone calls. No voice on the other end, just static or clicks. Then it was the smell, like sulphur, wafting through the attic when no one else was home. Strange sensations, lost time, a growing pressure behind the eyes. And then, in July 1953, they came. He described them as looking like clergymen, but without warmth. 3 men in perfect black suits, with matching black hats, like Homburgs. Their skin was pale, their mouths moved, but their voices came from somewhere else. Albert said they spoke inside his mind, that they floated an inch above the floor, that when they entered the room, the air changed, dense, heavy, filled with something unseen. The clocks stopped. The air tasted metallic. A yellow mist curled around their feet, though there was no source. The eyes of all 3 figures, he wrote later, suddenly lit up like flashlight bulbs. They told him, without emotion, that he must stop his research, that the mystery of the flying saucers was no longer his to pursue. They took the latest draft of Space Review from his desk and left him there, dizzy, nauseous, terrified. The room reeked of sulphur, and when they were gone, something in him had changed. That October, Albert mailed out the final issue of Space Review. No revelations, no confessions, just a chilling note. The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. The source is known, but any information is being withheld by orders from a higher source. He advised other UFO groups to be cautious, and then he went silent. For almost a decade, Bender refused to talk. Rumours swirled. Some said he had cracked the code and had been silenced. Others thought he'd had a breakdown. Even local newspapers in Bridgeport ran headlines: "Mystery visitors halt UFO researcher." When he finally did speak in 1962, it was through a strange little book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. In it, Bender laid out the full experience in his own voice: the sulfur, the telepathy, the glowing eyes, and the pressure to stop. There were beings from a distant world, from a planet called Kasich. They wore human shapes like masks, but they were something else underneath. They travelled between dimensions. They had helpers, beautiful women in white uniforms who accompanied them, observed him, visited his dreams. Some readers found it captivating, others found it deeply unsettling. Some simply called it utter nonsense. But it was Gray Barker, a fellow UFO researcher and early member of Bender's IFSB, who had told part of the story first. In his 1956 book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, Barker coined the phrase that would define the archetype forever: the men in black. A simple label, but one that captured something elemental: the suits, the silence, the pressure to forget. And once it had a name, it couldn't be unnamed. In Bender's version, the visitors were not human at all. And Barker, well, he never said they were. Gray Barker was something of a character in his own right, a former English teacher turned paranormal writer. He loved the strange, the fringe, the almost true. He had a talent for storytelling and a weakness for embellishment. Friends described him as charming, theatrical, sometimes unreliable. He'd been known to invent quotes, stage pranks, even write fake letters just to stir the pot. But he believed in the story, or at least, he believed it needed to be told. Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, framed Bender as a man who got too close to a dangerous truth. A man who was visited, warned, and shut down. The phrase he coined, "men in black," was never meant to be myth. But myth is what it became. The public didn't know what to make of it. Newspapers called it a hoax, psychologists a delusion. UFO believers called it a cover-up. Bender, for his part, never tried to convince anyone. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't chase the spotlight. After his book, he disappeared from public view. But the story lingered. Not because it was proven, but because it felt like a pattern. A strange event, a mysterious warning, a sudden silence. Others would come forward in the years that followed. Witnesses, researchers, contactees. Many of them would tell stories that echoed Bender's. The suits, the knock at the door, the feeling that you're not supposed to know what you just saw. And in every one of those stories, whether whispered over coffee or buried in a memo, you can hear the creaks of the floorboards in a Bridgeport attic. the sulphur in the air, the ticking clocks, and 3 men in black. But whether dream or deception, break down or break through, one thing became clear. Albert Bender's visitors were not the last. His silence and the eerie figures who demanded it became the foundation of an archetype. The men in black, not agents of government, but guardians of the hidden. A warning in a dark suit, a knock you don't hear until it's already happened, and a whisper in your mind that says, stop asking questions. Once the men in black had their name, they multiplied, not in headlines or photographs, but in whispers, in odd phone calls, in the hollow click of a tape recorder that had already run out of tape. After 1953, the men in black began to bleed through the seams of the UFO phenomenon, shifting from Bender's attic to motel rooms, farmhouse porches, and the back of the late model cars that idled just a little too quietly. They weren't always the same. Some wore perfect suits, tight at the collar and wrong at the shoulders. Some wore makeup as if trying to pass. Some blinked too slowly. Some never blinked at all. And the stories, like the figures themselves, only got stranger. In 1967, Toledo, Ohio, a man named Robert Richardson claimed to have hit a flying saucer while driving at night. He found a piece of metal near the impact site and turned it over to researchers. 3 days later, 2 men in black suits visited his home. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask how he was doing. They asked for the metal. Richardson explained it had been sent away for testing. The men left. A week later, 2 others came. These were different. Darker complexions, colder, and this time, less polite. One of them said, "If you want your wife to stay as pretty as she is, then you'd better get the metal back." They never returned. The sample disappeared, and Richardson stopped giving interviews. In early autumn 1976, Dr. Herbert Hopkins, a 58-year-old physician and hypnotist, stayed home alone while his wife and children went out to a neighborhood theater in Old Orchard Beach, Maine. He'd been investigating a local UFO encounter, the Stevens case, in which a young man named David Stevens claimed he and a friend had encountered a strange craft on a rural road, experienced missing time, and later recalled, under hypnosis, being taken aboard by telepathic beings with smooth, mushroom-like heads and slanted white eyes. Hopkins had been analysing the case materials, transcripts, tapes, and personal notes, when the phone rang. A calm voice identified itself as a representative from a regional UFO research group. He asked if Hopkins was alone, and if he might come by to discuss the case. Hopkins, uncharacteristically, said yes. Moments after hanging up, he moved toward the front door, perhaps expecting to straighten up, to be ready when the stranger arrived. But the man was already walking up the path. Hopkins saw no car. This was 76. There were no mobile phones, and there was no phone booth nearby. There was simply no time for the visitor to have called, travelled, and arrived so quickly. And yet, there he was. A tall figure in a dark navy suit, grey suede gloves, and a bowler-style hat, walking with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The man's skin was pale, too pale. His mouth was thin, with lipstick smeared to imitate the suggestion of lips. And behind the gloves, Hopkins caught a glimpse of the smudge, the red transfer of the artificial mouth, now imprinted on suede. His eyes were not remarkable, Hopkins would later recall, but the dog hid in the closet, and the cat didn't move at all. Once inside, the man didn't sit like a guest. He perched, like a thing in a borrowed body, waiting for the seams to hold. Hopkins tried to talk about the case, but the visitor rarely responded. And when he did, it was with rehearsed phrases. Yes, that's how I understand it. Then, the man asked Hopkins to reach into his pocket. He told him, with certainty, that there were 2 coins inside. Hopkins reached in. There were. The visitor asked him to remove one. Hopkins did. The man held it in his palm and said, "Watch the coin." It shimmered, flickered, blurred, and then it was gone. Neither you nor anyone else on this plane will ever see that coin again. Hopkins tried to brush it off as a trick, but the visitor wasn't finished. "Do you know how Barney Hill died?" he asked. "A heart attack," Hopkins answered. "No," the man said. "He died because he had no heart, just as you now have no coin." The air thickened. The light seemed to dim. Then came the instructions. Not demands, not questions, just statements. The man told Hopkins that he had recordings, that he would destroy them, and that he would end his investigation. He didn't ask, Hopkins later said. He just said it, and I wasn't angry. I just listened. Then the visitor began to fade. Not disappear, not yet, but weaken. His voice slowed. His words became spaced out, mechanical. "My energy is running low. Must go now." He stood slowly and left, grasping the railing, moved 1 foot at a time, clung to the porch like he didn't quite know how to walk. Then, instead of returning the way he came, he walked around the side of the building, paused, vanished around the corner. A moment later, a bright bluish-white light flooded the side of the house. Hopkins assumed it was headlights, but no car was ever seen. No tire marks in the driveway. Only a single strange tread pattern, something more like a tractor than a sedan. When his family returned, they found him shaken. He told them what happened. His son walked the yard with him, looking for clues. The tapes, the documents, he destroyed them. Later, he wished he hadn't. But something about that encounter had pushed past his rational mind, not through fear, but through compliance, a kind of inhuman persuasion. He would later say, "I believe he came from another plane, another dimension. That's what I think. And I think I'm not the only one." This next part isn't strictly about aliens. There are no flying saucers, no abductions, no discs in the sky. But it's still highly relevant. Because the men in black don't just appear in the company of UFOs. Sometimes they show up around something else entirely. Strange patterns, impossible coincidences, silent warnings that ripple outward, just before disaster strikes. And for me, just as much as anything in the realms of UFO folklore, this story has always stuck. Possibly because of the 2002 film adaptation starring Richard Gere, which everyone should absolutely make the time to watch. It captures something cold, unsettling, quietly terrifying, and it lingers with me to this day. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where lights danced over the river and a red-eyed figure haunted the sky, a journalist named John Keel had come looking for answers. He was no stranger to the strange, a former science fiction writer turned investigator of the unexplained. Keel had made a name for himself chasing monsters, apparitions, and aerial anomalies across the American landscape. But in Point Pleasant, he found something different. Not just sightings, but signs, patterns, whispers of prophecy, and something that whispered back. Keel wore a black suit. He asked too many questions, and he didn't smile often. One rainy night, his car broke down. He knocked on a farmhouse door, hoping to use the phone. They slammed the door in his face. Weeks later, the Silver Bridge collapsed, and dozens of townspeople lost their lives. That same family that slammed the door in his face told neighbours that the devil himself had come to visit. He had a beard. He was dressed in black. He came knocking just before the end. Keel had only wanted to call a tow truck. But in a place already warped by fear and prophecy, he had become the thing he was investigating. But despite this, despite the whispers and mistaken identities, Keel's role in shaping our understanding of the Men in Black cannot be overstated. And as a side note here, if you want me to investigate stories that may not necessarily be UFO or alien related, but still have one foot in the sphere of the weird, let me know in the comments. Keel didn't see them as government agents. Not really. Not in the traditional sense. In his writings, especially the Mothman prophecies, Keel described the Men in Black as something more elusive, more surreal, beings that glitched at the edges of reality, like echoes wearing human skin. They arrived in outdated cars. They asked questions that made no sense. Sometimes they didn't understand how to use utensils. Sometimes they didn't blink. He came to believe that the phenomenon, all of it, was part of a larger, interconnected system of manifestations. UFOs, apparitions, cryptids, prophetic dreams, strange visitors. All symptoms of the same intelligence, something reflected through us, wearing masks we would recognize. And the Men in Black? They were the messengers, the tricksters, the ones who showed up not to answer questions, but to unmake the ones you thought you had. By the end of his time in Point Pleasant, Keel wasn't chasing flying saucers. He was chasing patterns, and the Men in Black were always there, not to confirm the mystery, but to destabilize it, to remind you that the universe is stranger than you'll ever be comfortable with. Across the years, stories trickled in, sometimes from seasoned researchers, sometimes from frightened housewives, or shaken servicemen, or confused children. Each story a little different, but strangely familiar. The suits, the awkwardness, the way they didn't seem to understand forks or doorknobs or how to hold a smile. They drove spotless cars that vanished around corners, They left no footprints. They spoke in phrases that sounded memorized, like they were reading from a script translated by someone who had never heard a real human voice. Sometimes they smelled like sulphur. Sometimes they stank of cheap aftershave. And sometimes they didn't leave at all. They just faded. Not government, not human. For a time, many believed they were government agents. But government agents don't ask what televisions are. They don't make coins disappear. They don't show up before you've had a chance to tell anyone what you saw. Keel had another name for them. Ultraterrestrials. Not aliens from another planet, but entities from somewhere else entirely. From somewhere sideways, overlapping our reality in ways we didn't understand. They could appear, disappear, change form. They mimicked belief systems, exploited expectations, and thrived in moments of chaos and confusion. Oddly enough, the term didn't end with Keel. Hal Puthoff, an electrical engineer and program director at the Stanford Research Institute, and celebrity from within ufology, would later use the term in a paper titled Ultraterrestrial Models. There, Puthoff explored rational frameworks for explaining the phenomenon, not dismissing it as fantasy, but trying to work within science to make sense of the unscientific. He pointed out that the phenomenon behaves more like smoke than substance, impossible to pin down, always shifting just as we think we've grasped it. And so, in trying to classify the unclassifiable, Puthoff didn't rule out interdimensional visitors, advanced non-human intelligences, or even time travelers. In many ways, it echoed Keel's ideas, but where Keel leaned into myth and narrative, Puthoff tried to build a model, however theoretical, that could bridge the gap between mystery and mathematics. Keel's research led him to believe that whatever these things are, they wear masks to move through our world. He came to believe they weren't here to investigate us. They were here to influence us. People that experienced the Men in Black usually fell silent. Some gave up the study entirely. Some moved. Some never spoke again. One researcher, Jack Robinson, said his phone would ring and no one would speak. His mail arrived opened. A man in black would stand across from his apartment, just standing, for hours at a time. Dan Aykroyd, actor, comedian, and all-around badass, is also a lifelong experiencer, a walking encyclopedia of the unexplained. And in the early 2000s, he was working on a TV series called Out There, a show that was meant to bring serious discussions about UFOs and the paranormal into the mainstream. It was shaping up to be something special. Interviews with witnesses, scientists, and rumour has it, insiders. But then something strange happened. One day, Aykroyd stepped outside the studio in New York City for a smoke. He answered a call from Britney Spears, strange enough in its own right, when he looked up and noticed two men in black suits standing across the street beside a black sedan. They were still, silent, watching. He glanced away for just a moment, and when he looked back, they were gone. 2 hours later, the show was cancelled. No broadcast, no explanation, just gone. Officially, it was chalked up to creative differences. The studio wanted something lighter, more comedy, more chaos. Aykroyd wanted some serious conversations with real people. But the timing was uncanny. The cancellation came the very day he was supposed to film an interview with Dr. Stephen Greer and UFO conspiracy theorist Stephen Bassett. For Aykroyd, it was not hard to see the pattern. The stories aren't always credible. Some were hoaxes, some were later retracted. Others were simply too bizarre to believe. But the pattern remained. Not a shape, but a shadow. A feeling that someone was watching the watchers. To return to John Keel once more. In time, Keel himself began to slip. He stopped trusting the mail. He stopped trusting time. He wrote that reality itself had begun to flicker, like an old film reel. Keel often noted that the phenomenon didn't just disrupt people's schedules, it worked its way under their skin, into their thoughts. It shook something deeper, not just the mind, but the emotional core. Witnesses often report feelings of dread, confusion, obsession, and a lingering sense that something had reached inside them and rearranged the furniture. Keel came to Point Pleasant to investigate the Mothman, but somewhere along the way, the story folded in on itself, and the man in black was him. The further you follow the men in black, the less human they begin to seem. The faces blur, the movements glitch. They aren't just agents in dark suits. They're mirrors, masks, symbols that know you're looking at them. They don't always show up after a UFO sighting. Sometimes there's no sighting at all, just a presence in the room, a knock at the door no one remembers answering, or a dream that stains the waking day. These are the other men in black, not visitors from another planet, but reflections of something deeper. In Native American traditions, there are stories of beings who mimic the living. They look like your uncle, your neighbour, sometimes even yourself. But something's off. The voice is close, but not quite. The words are flat, empty, like they've been rehearsed. The face is human, but only just. And they know things they shouldn't know. These are the spirit mimics, shape-shifting, voice-borrowing entities who wear human appearance like a costume. You'll find them across indigenous legends, the Kushtaka of the Pacific Northwest, luring travellers with cries that sound almost like a child. The skinwalkers of Navajo lore, who steal faces and walk by night. Of course, we will revisit the skinwalkers in a future episode. And the water babies of the Great Basin, spirits that mimic infant cries to lure the living into death. These entities appear to arrive at the edges of things, after a death, before a disaster, in the wake of something strange, not to comfort, not to clarify, but to confuse, to destabilize, to remind you that reality isn't always what it seems. Author Brad Steiger, one of the first to use the phrase spirit mimics, described them as interdimensional impersonators, beings who try to look human but never quite get it right. Notable ufology author Nick Redfern echoes this, chronicling encounters with human-shaped visitors who behave just a little wrong. They dress in outdated styles. They speak in strange slang. They seem unsure of basic human habits, like how to drink water or what a spoon is for. But worst of all, they often seem to know things they shouldn't, just like the men in black. Former Director of Investigations with the British UFO Research Association, Jenny Randalls, once pointed out that these uncanny figures, from fairies to demons to MIBs, all share a single trait. They adapt to the culture they appear in. They change their masks to match our fears. Which brings us to Gregory Little, psychologist and author of books on native cosmology. He suggests that the phenomenon in general, the grey aliens, the men in black, may not be government agents or extraterrestrials at all, but spiritual imposters, entities from another level of being, whose appearance reflects ancient legends more than modern cover stories. Not aliens, spirit mimics. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because there's another theory that rhymes with this one. Tulpas, a concept from Tibetan mysticism, later embraced by Western occultists and modern paranormal theorists. A tulpa is a thought form, a being conjured into existence by belief and imagination. In other words, a mental projection so strong it takes on form. Could the men in black be tulpas created by cultural expectation? Or perhaps the inverse, archetypal mimics that adopt our fears to make themselves more real? In his book, The Invisible College, Jacques Vallée proposed that the UFO phenomenon doesn't function as a simple message, but as a kind of psychological feedback loop, a conditioning system, he wrote, intended to force us to perceive a greater reality. I'm paraphrasing there, but Vallée writes with a precision and elegance that's hard to imitate. If you've never read his work, I highly recommend it. In that context, the men in black become more than folklore. They become mirrors. They reflect our assumptions about secrecy, surveillance, danger, and identity. But their real origin might not lie in Roswell or Washington, but somewhere between the worlds, where thought can take form, where stories become masks, and where something just beyond the veil is always listening. Then there's Philip K. Dick, science fiction author and philosopher of paranoia, a man who believed the Roman Empire never ended, a man who woke from a dental visit convinced a pink beam of light had filled his mind with alien knowledge. Dick's fiction explores worlds that fracture under scrutiny, where time loops, people are copies, and truth is contextual. In his 1977 speech in Metz, France, he said, "If you find this world bad, you should see some of the others." He spoke of overlapping realities and simulated timelines edited by unseen forces. In that worldview, men in black wouldn't just be agents in the system. They'd be its architects, system maintenance, code keepers stepping in when someone nears the core. They're not villains, they're corrective software. George Nolfi's 2011 film, loosely based on Dick's 1954 short story, Adjustment Team, visualizes something eerily connected to tonight's subject. In his film, the agents arrive in sharp suits and hats. Hats are literally power conduits in the story. They open doors into new realities, rerouting lives to match an unseen plan. They show up before you realize you're even off script, just like the Men in Black. The movie's agents echo the MIB's formality, timing, and disquieting purpose. They intervene, correct, and vanish, not to confront, but to erase. This is how far we've come in 2025. And yes, I'm using a Matt Damon movie to explain our possible reality. This is the timeline we're in. In film and fiction alike, the suit and the hat become symbols, not of government, but of control, whether real or fictional. If you tell a story enough times, does it become real? Belief conjuring reality isn't just a social media trend disguised as manifesting. It's a deeply explored idea in philosophy, in mysticism, in parapsychology, and I find it extremely relevant to our subject. A knock at the door, a voice on the phone, a dream that doesn't feel like a dream. Not because someone is sending it, but because we are. Trying to grasp a reality that deliberately slips through your fingers can be exhausting. So let's come back to something solid, something we can touch, real people, real events, real men in black. The men in black we've explored so far moved like shadows, silent, stilted, and just a little too late. They shimmered at the edges of reality. They whispered through dreams. But not all of them are made of fog and fear. Some wear badges. Some carry clipboards. Some knock at your door in broad daylight, with a government vehicle idling at the curb and a practiced smile on their face. They don't vanish in a flash of light. They leave paperwork, and sometimes wreckage in their wake. These aren't dream figures or spirit mimics. They are real men, trained in psychological operations and counterintelligence. And yet, somehow, they play the same role. They tell people to forget. They cast doubt on memories. They feed stories so strange they become indistinguishable from myth. You see, sometimes the men in black come with a clearance code, and sometimes they don't. But what makes the next chapter so chilling isn't just what they've said in the past. It's that they were allowed to say it in the first place. Because in this world, truth can be sharpened into a weapon, and when wielded by the right hands, it cuts deeper than any lie. Next, we step into one of the strangest and most tragic episodes in UFO lore. The story of Paul Bennewitz, and the man sent to dismantle him from the inside. Richard Doty. Paul Bennewitz was by all accounts a bright and curious man. A physicist and founder of Thunder Scientific Laboratories. His office sat in close proximity to Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. From the roof of that building, Bennewitz began observing strange lights over the Manzano Mountains in 1979. He recorded radio signals he couldn't explain, intercepted what he believed to be non-human transmissions, and began compiling his findings in earnest. And that's when he got the attention of the US Air Force. Enter Richard Doty, a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. His job? Counterintelligence, surveillance, security, and in this case, obfuscation. In October 1980, Doty and his colleagues began meeting with Bennewitz. They examined his footage, listened to his radio intercepts, and said very little. Then, a few weeks later, Doty did something extraordinary. He delivered a forged document to Bennewitz, It looked official. It referenced alien bodies, a UFO crash, and a site in the Manzano weapons storage area. This was not a leak. It was a plant. That document marked the beginning of an elaborate campaign of disinformation. According to declassified records, congressional testimony, and Doty's own admission, the goal was simple: confuse Bennewitz, distract him, send him down the wrong rabbit hole. And I guess you could say it worked. Over the next year, the web grew more complex. Bennewitz received more documents, including a fabricated Project Aquarius memo describing joint US alien operations and references to Majestic 12. He was even given software to decode alien transmissions. Doty wasn't working alone. Civilian UFO researcher Bill Moore was also recruited to feed Bennewitz these fictions. Though Moore later claimed he did so reluctantly, the result was the same. Bennewitz, already primed to believe, dove headlong into the narrative being handed to him. He began to believe there was a secret underground base at Dulce, that aliens were abducting humans, that they had infiltrated the government. He even came to believe his wife had been implanted with a tracking device. In 1988, the inevitable happened. Bennewitz suffered a complete mental breakdown and was hospitalized. And that's where the story could have ended. But instead, it leaked. In 1989, Bill Moore took to the stage at the MUFON Symposium and admitted the truth. He had helped the government disseminate false information to Bennewitz. That disclosure, paired with journalistic investigations and FOIA releases in the 1990s, revealed the full scale of the operation. A 1992 CIA memo flatly stated that Bennewitz was the target of a program of psychological destabilization by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and that the documents were signed by Doty. A 2024 congressional hearing confirmed that Doty delivered a forged memo to Bennewitz on November 17, 1980, and admitted under oath that he was instructed to do so to confuse him. Why? Because Bennewitz had accidentally picked up on a classified NSA program at Kirtland. His equipment, as rudimentary as it was, had pierced a veil he wasn't meant to see, and rather than simply ask him to stop, the Air Force decided to steer him into fantasy, into madness. Guardians of the hidden. The ramifications are still being felt today. According to researchers like Greg Bishop and Mark Pilkington, many of the core elements of modern UFO lore, Majestic 12, Dulce Base, secret alien treaties, can be traced directly back to Bennewitz's disinformation. In other words, what started as a psychological smokescreen became the foundation for an entire belief system. And yet, it may not be quite that simple. While Bennewitz really did receive information on those particular aspects of ufology, it's important to point out that there is evidence aside from the information he was handed that lends credence to some of the claims. Dulce, abductions, Majestic 12. There are paper trails, missing government expenditures, and first-hand testimonies that complicate the narrative. As with so much in ufology, everything is up for debate. But the effect it had on Paul Bennewitz is not up for debate. The breakdown, his resulting institutionalization, the reality that bent so far it shattered around a man, was indeed the sole intention of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation and Richard Doty. Whether elements of truth are sprinkled into the mist of deception, we may never really know. What we do know is this: the line between fact and fabrication was deliberately blurred, and the men in black, in this case, didn't need glowing eyes or vanishing coins. Doty, for his part, has given contradictory interviews over the years. In some, he defends his actions as necessary for national security. In others, he suggests he was only following orders. But the documents speak plainly. A civilian was deliberately deceived, driven into paranoia and insanity. In this context, the men in black take on a more chilling form, not visitors from another dimension, but agents of disinformation. And Doty didn't vanish into obscurity. In recent years, he's re-emerged on the conference circuit, giving interviews, attending UFO panels, and even appearing in documentaries. Strangely, he's now, quote-unquote, retired. He now speaks openly about the very tactics he once employed, admitting to planting false stories, infiltrating UFO groups, and notably, coordinating with mainstream media outlets. According to Doty, the intelligence community maintains contact with news organizations to shape the narrative. Mirage men. A revelation that dovetails uncomfortably with another part of America's history. Project Mockingbird. The CIA's documented effort to influence and manipulate the press during the Cold War. In this section, we'll explore how this program, real and confirmed, serves as a backdrop to the idea that the truth itself can be weaponized, and how the men in black may not be here to silence the truth, but perhaps, like Doty, bury it in noise. Sometimes the mystery isn't born in what is hidden, it's born in what is manufactured. And in that fog, no one can see clearly. Witnesses become unreliable, researchers chase shadows, and the truth, whatever it was, slips away. It's tempting to imagine all cover-ups as coordinated, top-down operations. Classified files in locked drawers, phone calls in the dead of night. But sometimes control doesn't look like secrecy. It looks like noise. During the Cold War, the CIA launched a program called Operation Mockingbird, a covert initiative to influence domestic and foreign media. The goal? To guide public perception. Not necessarily by what was said, but by who said it, how it was framed, and what was left out. Journalists were recruited, editors were briefed, and both were paid handsomely. Entire narratives were softened, redirected, or buried outright. And while the full scope of the program remains debated, we know this much. It happened, and its impact on American media was real. So ask yourself this question. If it happened, and it worked, why would they ever stop? When it comes to UFOs, the connection is subtle but powerful. By the 1950s, public interest in flying saucers had become an unexpected liability. National security agencies feared not only the implications of unexplained craft, but the sheer volume of attention toward the skies. UFO reports, after all, could clog communication channels, spook military personnel, or even act as cover for foreign surveillance efforts. So a new strategy emerged: ridicule as containment. UFO witnesses were painted as cranks. Researchers were portrayed as fringe eccentrics. And the men in black, whether human or otherwise, became cartoonish, distant echoes of something no longer serious. The truth wasn't erased. It was drowned. In laughter, in parody, in late-night punchlines and grainy tabloid spreads. And when something was worth hiding, it was hidden in plain sight, and the surrounding noise made it easy to slip away. Perhaps the most famous movie of all related to this. Well, I don't even need to say its name. You know the one. Suits, shades, A-list stars. A quirky government agency cleaning up extraterrestrial messes, one joke at a time, behind the scenes. It's fun. It's clever. And tucked into all that charm is a detail most people forget by the time the credits roll. The tabloids. They call them the hot sheets. Outlandish headlines about aliens and psychic pets and Elvis being alive. And yet, within the story, those headlines are true. The absurd, the exaggerated, the obviously fake is secretly the most accurate reporting of all. It's played for laughs, but it's also a mirror. A reminder that in a world overflowing with misinformation, sometimes the truth doesn't hide in shadow. It hides in plain sight, on a street corner, in a grocery aisle, on a page no one takes seriously. And every day, thousands walk right past it, never thinking to stop and read. This is the legacy of disinformation. Not to disprove, but to discredit. To take a subject seriously long enough to reshape it, and then drop it back into the public arena as a joke. And when you've laughed at something enough times, you stop looking for the punchline. They show up again and again, not just in UFO stories, but across our culture. In the X-Files, they're the smoking man and the syndicate, faceless men in trench coats whose job isn't to discover the truth, but to bury it, to decide what the public can handle, to erase the parts of the story that don't fit. In The Matrix, they're literal agents of the system, men in sharp suits and dark ties, sent not to investigate, but to suppress, not to uncover reality, but to keep you asleep inside it. We don't just imagine the men in black. We need them as symbols, as fears, as projections of a deep, persistent suspicion that somewhere behind the curtain, someone else is calling the shots. Not aliens, not demons, not interdimensional travelers. Just men, nameless, invisible. And here's the twist, the part that no one likes to say out loud. They made it worse. It's the cruel joke at the heart of the Bennewitz affair. By trying to kill the story, they made it immortal. Every piece of disinformation slipped under his door. Every whisper about secret bases and hybrid programs. Every friendly visit from an unnamed official. It all coalesced into a mythology that couldn't be walked back. Because once the men in black had a place in the narrative, even real men with credentials, with titles, with briefcases, began to look like them. The archetype had taken hold. A black car pulling up on a quiet street. A knock at the door after midnight. A man in a suit who won't quite meet your eyes. Was it just an agent, or something else? It doesn't matter, because the idea of the men in black had become self-sustaining. Now, they don't need a program. They don't need a mission. They live in a feedback loop, where fiction becomes belief, and belief shapes perception. One lie told to one man became 1,000 stories, 1,000 sightings, 1,000 whispers passed along in UFO conventions, chat rooms, Reddit threads, and midnight radio shows. So I guess in the end, it worked. Because what's harder to untangle than a cover-up? A cover-up so tangled that no one knows what was real to begin with. Not even the people doing the covering. As for the men in black, are they still out there? The files are dusty, the names are old. Bennewitz is long gone. Doty has apparently retired. I suspect the suits now wear digital camouflage, not fedoras. So is it over? Or have the men in black simply evolved? Because people are still reporting them. Strange visitors who knock without warning. Flat-toned voices, faces that seem slightly wrong. Encounters that leave no trace, but don't feel like dreams. And the strange part, these modern encounters rarely follow UFO sightings. Sometimes they happen without any apparent cause. A strange phone call, a dark car parked outside. No saucers, no lights, just the feeling that someone or something is watching. So we ask again, are the men in black still government agents? Are they psychic projections? Are they the result of belief itself looping back into reality? In a world dominated by surveillance, capitalism, misinformation and deep fakes, the concept of them has only become more slippery. The modern men in black may not knock on your door. They might just alter the algorithm, make the wrong file disappear, shadow ban the right question. The control system, if that's what this is, may no longer need physical agents, but the archetype remains. Because fear adapts, myths persist, and the shadows we try to outrun, maybe they evolve, independent of the reality we think we understand. Room 504 was silent this morning. No one checked out, no footsteps on the gravel, no key handed back, just the faintest smell of ozone and a triangle of dust on the nightstand where something might have been. Housekeeping says the bed was as cold as the moment before they walked through the door. The bathroom mirror was fogged, but the tap hadn't run. They left no name, no luggage, just the memory of their presence. Some say the men in black are agents of the government. Some say they're projections of our own subconscious, tulpa-like echoes in tailored suits. Others say they're guardians of something sacred, a secret so profound it hides itself by pretending to be absurd. Are they here to protect us from what we're not ready to see, or to make sure we never ask the right question? Are they the veil, or the hand that pulls it shut. They knock at the edges of reason. They follow you without footsteps. They speak without moving their lips. And when they leave something behind. A distortion in memory, a coin that isn't there, a thought that wasn't yours. If they're real, then truth is stranger than belief. If they're not, then the men in black are proof that belief itself can shape the world we live in. Thank you for spending the night with us. If you enjoyed your stay at the Dreamland Motel, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review at the front desk. Just remember, not every guest signs the register, and not every shadow is just a trick of the light. Good night.